Honourable House now resume its sitting. Call of the roll.
Mr. Witter, Mr. Samuda, Mr. Holness, Dr. Clark, Mr. Shaw, Dr. Chang, Mr. Montague, Ms. Grange, Mr. Henry, Mr. Bartlett, Mr. Mackenzie, Mr. Chuck, Mr. Darrell Vaz, Mr. Warmington, Mrs. Robinson, Mr. Hutchinson, Dr. Tufton, Mrs. Williams, Mrs. Malahoo Fort, Mr. Spencer, Mr. Green, Mr. Terrelong, Mr. Main, Mr. Arscott, Mr. Azan, Dr. Bloomfield, Mr. Brown, Dr. Brown-Burke, Mr. Buchanan, Mr. Buchanan, Mr. Bunting, Dr. Campbell, Mr. Leslie Campbell, Mr. Clark, Mrs. Cuthbert Flynn, Ms. Daly, Mr. Daly, Mr. Daly, Mrs. Dalrymple Philibert, Dr. Dunn, Mr. Fagan, Mr. Fagan, Dr. Clark, Dr. Ferguson, Dr. Ferguson, Mr. Golding, Dr. Guy, Miss Hannah, Mr. Hales, Mrs. Holness, Mr. Hilton, Mr. Jackson, Mr. Kellier, Dr. McNeil, Ms. Nita, Mr. Paulwell, Mr. Michael Phillips, Dr. Phillips, Mr. Pickers-Gill, Mr. Redmond, Mr. Robertson, Mr. Robinson, Mr. Stewart, Reverend Thwaites, Mr. Dwayne Vaz, Dr. Wheatley, Mr. Wright. Mr. Wright?
Statements by ministers.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Culture, Gender, Entertainment and Sport will make a statement on the 153rd anniversary of the execution of the Right Excellent Paul Bogle and the Right Excellent George William Gordon. Minister.
Minister Grange.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, 153 years ago, on this date, October 23, 1865, George William Gordon, member of the House of Assembly, and the man in whose honor this honorable house has been named, was hanged. The following day, October 24, 1865, Paul Bogle, Baptist deacon, the man who led the war in which George William Gordon was implicated, was also hanged. Today, a grateful nation recalls with a mixture of pride and humility the fierce determination and selfless dedication of these two Jamaicans. Mr. Speaker, words penned by George William Gordon on the day before his execution in a letter to his dear wife Lucy bear great significance. And I quote, "It is the will of my Heavenly Father that I should suffer in obeying his command to relieve the poor and needy, to protect, so far as I was able, the oppressed. This, I believe, Mr. Speaker, sums up very well his own sense of the mission to which he was called by his Creator and committed as a politician. George William Gordon saw the role of the Parliament as an instrument and agency of the voice of the poor and oppressed, a voice for justice, social upliftment, and overall national development. This was in contrast to the perception of the role of the House of Assembly by the British slave-owning establishment. Gordon was vociferous in his protestations and demanding of answers from the colonial powers for which he suffered the ultimate sacrifice. Mr. Speaker, Gordon's mission is one which we ourselves must uphold as we continue in this honorable House to build upon the institutions of governance we have inherited, ensuring throughout that they work to the greater benefit of our people. Indeed, it is a tacit reminder of our cause to dedicate ourselves to the upliftment of the poor and needy, to protect and empower the vulnerable, and provide opportunities for sustainable prosperity for all our people. This we must do by ensuring that Parliament remains the agency of action for the creation of legislation and policy that enhance the quality of life of our people, assuring thereby that their creative imagination, industry, and craft will achieve economic success within their personal and collective lives. To do less would be to dishonor the names of these our national heroes in this George William Gordon House. Mr. Speaker, in like manner, Paul Bogle, who commandeered the largest struggle that culminated in outright war in October 1865, points us to the levels of social and political activism that we must be prepared to replicate in the interests of the prosperity of the people. Bogle led hundreds of grassroots Jamaican people to confront the state in their search for those rights and freedoms they assumed would have accompanied emancipation from enslavement in 1838, but which remained elusive decades later. By way of a litany of protest, those who had emerged from slavery and their descendants refused to live in a society that simply continued the slave relations of production. They lobbied, they petitioned, and protested for equal rights and justice, even marching from Stony Gut to Morant Bay, and from Morant Bay to the capital in Spanish Town to seek audience with Governor Eyre. Mr. Speaker, this level of political action has been replicated throughout the history of modern Jamaica, causing us to reflect on the challenges that our people continue to experience and our role in confronting and remedying them. As we pause to reflect on these our two national heroes and their role in the Morant Bay struggle and war, their selfless devotion to the improved condition of the masses of the people, we are called upon today to model in our own representation and management of the affairs of our people the examples of caring, consistency, sacrifice, and gallantry exercised by Gordon and Bogle as they took to the trenches on behalf of the masses of our people. Mr. Speaker, today we pause in this honorable House on behalf of a grateful people. On this 23rd day of October 2018, 153 years later, to salute and pay homage to the Right Excellent George William Gordon and the Right Excellent Paul Bogle for their tireless and selfless dedication to the cause of the poor and propelling our nation to the makings of a new social, economic, and political order, the forerunners of what we hold dear today. May we, who continue here in this honorable house, Mr. Speaker, reflect on their sacrifice, even as we also recognize that our stewardship is also within the will of our Heavenly Father. May we pledge our sweat, our tears, and our lives to the greater good of the people of Jamaica at home and abroad. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Treat.
Mr. Speaker, first may I thank the Minister for the first time, I think, at least as long as I've been in this House, for memorializing the dates of significance for these two national heroes, and I believe for all of our national heroes. It's a very wonderful thing for us to do, and I commend her. Mr. Speaker, we are the legacy. We incarnate and flesh the legacy of Bogle and Gordon, particularly these national heroes, because of our parliamentary role and their commitment in various ways to representative government. I rely on the work of the late great attorney Ansel Hart, historian, who has written about George William Gordon, and on the work, seminal work of Devon Dick, Reverend Dr. Devon Dick, on Paul Bogle. As far as Gordon was concerned, Mr. Hart indicates that he was a most unlikely martyr. He was a middle-class man, and his original political tendencies would have not easily allied with those of Paul Bogle. However, they were united in a common understanding of human worth. And interestingly, and of significance 153 years after, Mr. Speaker, is that it was the bond of the Christian faith that brought them together. Gordon and his descendants were Scottish Presbyterians. He was, however, drawn to the authenticity, to the folk integrity of the native Baptists, of whom Bogle was foremost. And it was beyond ritual and liturgy and superficial culture, it was the deep understanding of the dignity of man, misunderstood and still suppressed 30 years after the abolition of slavery, during which spiritually both slave master and slave were imprisoned. That still persisted, and it was a vessel that had to be broken by the radical action of both of these patriots. George William Gordon and Paul Bogle were united by a common virtue, strange then in the circumstances of the color class divide of the times, and still unfortunately not sufficiently apparent in our times. And that virtue is generosity of spirit, an openness to concern beyond one's individual interests, placing the needs of those who were most vulnerable in the society. In those days, the landless, the newly emancipated, the uneducated persons, reeling as they were at the time by the fact that the colonial legislature had proposed a Negro Education Act which the local assembly had refused to implement. Can you imagine that? Generosity of spirit, if we are true to the legacy of these two heroes, must characterize our conduct with one another and our approach to the craft of governance, even in this time, where the narrowness of another age, the overtaking of hedonism, of narrow individualism, unfortunately, creates in the minds of these young people here from the university and from the preparatory school some level of cynicism and skepticism about our intentions and our actions. Bogle and Gordon both shared without the words a preferential option for the poor. Do we in this Parliament always evince that, Mr. Speaker, is the question that comes to my mind today. Both of them, from different racial origins, nonetheless found a common cause that transcended the rigid boundaries of race and class at the time. There is an example for us, even now, to adhere to. They were both victims of a travesty of justice. Unfortunately, although things have improved greatly, and for which we must be grateful, there are some still in this society who have the impression, if not, are not the victims of the travesties of justice, where unfortunately lies are told upon them to take them into custody for a long time or a short time. And so often we find that the system which we want to think as limpid and pure is really not that. The ethic of public service, which binds your good self, sir, look at the length of time you have spent in public service, and so many here, was part of their spiritual construct and must be remembered. And the courage of both of them, that not only understand that there was some depth of human understanding, but also a loyalty to the land of their birth, yet a colony, that would have caused them to bear the ultimate penalty of death without remorse and without bitterness. Mr. Speaker, on this occasion of memory, let us be grateful for the freedoms of our time, despite the occasional excesses of our parliamentary conduct. Fortunately, in this society, not only here, but in every other forum, the forum of mass media, of social media, etc., we enjoy the capacity and the right to speak our minds, to be contrary, and hopefully also to be constructive. And so, Mr. Speaker, I draw one last issue. Paul Bogle particularly, and followed by Gordon, spoke to the land hunger of the peasantry, the post-emancipation peasantry. Spoke to the fact that there was no voice for them, none could vote. Gordon, by virtue of his property status and the fact that he paid 10 and sixpence in taxes, had some franchise. Bogle would never have had under the existing laws. Fortunately, all of us do. And many of us, unfortunately, do not make use of that and spurn that tremendous freedom that we now have. And on the issue of land, Mr. Speaker, surely this 153rd memorial must encourage us to make haste in the task of land reform, in the task of ensuring that the prime gift of God beyond our humanity will be put to productive use, inclusive of all types and classes of our people, so that we have no landlessness in this country, but rather the full use of that which only can endure to our prosperity. It is my honor, as history would have it, George William Gordon was the uncle of my grandmother, my paternal grandmother. I hope I do not suffer his fate, but I hope that his spirit may somehow entitle us and strengthen us to move beyond. I thank you for the opportunity of responding to this message.
Dr. Ferguson.
As one of the two members of Parliament in St. Thomas, I want to thank the Minister for bringing this our presentation to this Honourable House this afternoon. I believe Mr. Speaker, that the name Paul Bogle, the name William Gordon, is well known in our parts. And while they have emerged as national heroes, in St. Thomas, where we have had to live with those names, we have had to live with the experience of those institutions that have emerged: Paul Bogle High School, Paul Bogle Vocational Training Center, Paul Bogle Foundation, Paul Bogle Development Trust, and others. The fact is, Honourable Minister, and I think you are well aware, some of the issues that have come along the way, when we take into account what would have happened in 1865, when we take into account the impact of that, not only nationally but regionally and internationally, the Morant Bay Uprising, and when we take into account the institutions that emerge in that post-period, the development of the Jamaica Constabulary Force, there were significant developments as it relates to the health sector and policies that emerged in that period. But most importantly, along the way, the question of land and land reform still remain a major challenge nationally, but for the people of St. Thomas particularly. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, as we contemplate this conversation, it is important for us, government past, present, to recognize the work and worth of Paul Bogle and William Gordon. This house in which we are meeting today was named after the Right Excellent William Gordon. And the truth is, Mr. Speaker, is that in St. Thomas today and across the country, what they would have labored for still remains a major challenge for us as a country. Land and land reform. Government remains the largest landowner in our country. Yet we have had issues, successive governments, in relation to how we have made those persons who are landless, how we have empowered them. We speak, and sometimes glibly, about 700,000 squatters in our country. 700,000. But outside of persons who would be classified as squatters, there are thousands and thousands of persons, including professionals, not just young professionals, teachers, nurses, doctors, who today do not own a little piece of this rock. And therefore, as we celebrate these men, I believe the time has come for us to seriously take on the question of land reform. One of the greatest experiment, one could call it, well, starting with the land settlements in the 70s, but in the 90s and 2000 dealing with Operation Pride. And many persons have seen Operation Pride only in the context of a scandal. But Operation Pride, Mr. Speaker, brought to 30,000 Jamaicans notices of allotment, many of which was converted into titles. And I know the member from Central Kingston is well aware of that. That over 30,000 persons became beneficiaries of land. Never before in the history of this country. And so today, as we laud Paul Bogle, and while we laud him, the minister is well aware that the statue of Paul Bogle is still in Kingston. And it has been so for over a decade. We have had many conversations. It has passed from one administration to another, and the statue of Bogle remains in Kingston. Madam Member from Central St. Catherine, an Honourable Minister, the people of St. Thomas is still clamoring as to what will happen in relation to Paul Bogle's statue. Whether we are going to have the statue returned or whether we are going to be commissioning a new statue. But it has remained controversial across both administrations. But the time has come. The noise is getting louder. And I am now saying again, Madam Minister, that the ball is in your court now. And I am calling on you, as one of the members of Parliament in St. Thomas, to do something about it. The greatest tribute that you could pay to Paul Bogle today is to tell the people of St. Thomas when that statue will be returned and what would be the modality. I am very clear that as we go forward and we celebrate, and I listen to the arguments coming from the Minister of Local Government, I am very clear that the people of St. Thomas, to whom I am accountable to, and more so Eastern St. Thomas, I am saying to you, Mr. Speaker, that in paying tribute to Paul Bogle, in paying tribute to William Gordon, we have to do it, and I am saying we are doing it to Madam Minister against the background that when Paul Bogle marched in on the 11th of October 1865, there were only 104 persons in St. Thomas that were eligible to vote. Today, there are almost 70,000 voters in the parish of St. Thomas. And I take on board that the configuration would have been different. But it is a much different time and a much different place. I appeal to you, Honourable Minister, and I know that you have been sympathetic in the past, so I'm not raising it in the context of being controversial. I am raising it in the context that the time is now and the people are impatient at this time. I thank you for bringing this matter to the Parliament today, and I look forward to the outcomes of these interventions. I thank you.
Mr. Shimura.
Mr. Speaker, I rise simply to lend support to this very relevant and timely statement by the Minister. The fact of the matter is that the area that I wish to comment on is the area dealing with the provision of housing for the most needy in our country. Mr. Speaker, I've said it before and I'll say it again, and I'll ever speak of landmark legislation that was passed in this Honourable House in 1977, when I was a mere caretaker in the constituency then of Northwest St. Andrew, when the then Minister of Housing, former member for Southern St. Andrew, your predecessor, moved and had passed in this House an act called the Local Improvement Communities Amenities Act, which I will never forget as long as I live, because it occurred to me and it spoke to the very reason why I chose to go into public life and to take up politics as a full-time occupation. Because I had seen the injustice meted out to the poor, who, because of their state of life, as we term it, squatted on lands that they did not own, but were neglected because the values at the time were so insignificant. And not only did they go on those lands, but they developed families. And from those lands and from those locations sprung some of the brightest and best who eventually contributed to the development of this country. But the one thing that they wished to have most of all was tenure. Children grew up and had children. But what happened too often is that the moment the land began to improve in value, either the original owners or their relatives sought to evict the people who had been living there for 30 years and rear their children there, in the interest of benefiting themselves by a higher price. And so when the then Minister of Housing made it impossible so to do by declaring these lands as lands that could not so be seized, where people would not suffer the humiliation and deprivation of being thrown off, that I embrace that. And in my own constituency today, a vast percentage of my constituency have grown up. Communities have developed among those types of people who I have, in my own little way, sought to protect their interests. And they have gone on to, through both governments, develop infrastructure to enable them to not suffer the shame and embarrassment of the location in which they live. I have seen where young girls and young men going to school were ashamed to have anyone drop them off at the corner, at their house. They drop them up the road. Many of them, if it's raining, would put on their old shoes as soon as they get to the head of the lane and walk with their good shoes in their hands to go into their humble dwelling. And Mr. Speaker, why I speak feelingly about this is because I dedicated myself to ensuring that whatever I could do in my lifetime, in association with the people of my constituency who fall into that unfortunate category, I would do. And I have lived to see where we are no longer suffering in many of these communities from any sense of embarrassment, but rather the contrary. a sense of pride in what they have been able to do with so little. And so, hanging over the heads of many of these persons still remain a lack of adequate tenure. And that, as they say, time has a spanner to fit every knot. And right now, I find myself in the good fortune of being located in the Ministry of Housing with responsibility for ensuring that these people get their titles. Hundreds of titles have been languishing. For 30, I have been a member of Parliament in this Honourable House for 38 years. And from the very outset, lots were subdivided and lotted out to the existing residents. Receipts were given where they paid for the lots. Small amounts then, great amounts today, but no title. That is going to change. So, Mr. Speaker, in my little way, I can associate with the sentiments of our national heroes, Paul Bogle and our William Gordon, this building bears his name. He says, a white man like me. In as much as I don't know his ancestors, he doesn't know mine. So, Mr. Speaker, I support wholeheartedly the sentiments attached, and I know what it means for the minister who has a constituency that so many people are today still deprived of adequate housing and the sense of belonging that ought to attend anybody in this country at this time. We have to move in that direction no matter what. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Members, I want to thank the Minister for bringing this to our attention. The freedom that we enjoy today, no doubt, initiated by these two men, their political action, their demands. We are here today. So I'm going to ask members of Parliament, visitors and the press to let us stand in a moment of silence to recognize these two men who have sacrificed so much for us. May their memories stay with us for a long time. May the freedom that we have because of them stay with us for a lifetime. Members, while we were deliberating on our two national heroes, some young children from the Little People's Prep School had to leave. However, I had greeted them earlier on behalf of members. I wish you to recognize that they were here. We also have students from the University of the West Indies, Senate leadership, and Georgia Lean Hall. Please welcome them for us. Announcements.
Laid on the table of the House today are the following: Minister Paper number 100, entitled Cabinet Agenda Issues, dated September 17 and 24, 2018. Special report of the Sessional Select Committee of the House of Representatives on the Infrastructure and Physical Development on the motion regarding the construction industry policy.
Bills brought from the Senate. Members, please participate. Bills brought from the Senate.
The following is a message from the President of the Senate to the Honourable House of Representatives. I have the honour to advise the Honourable House of Representatives that on the 12th day of October 2018, a bill entitled An Act to Repeal the Fishing Industry Act to provide for the efficient and effective management and sustainable development of fisheries, aquaculture, and other related activities in accordance with internationally recognized norms, standards, and best practices, and to provide for matters connected therewith and incidental thereto, was passed in the Senate with 25 amendments, for which the Honourable Senate desires the concurrence of this Honourable House. I also have the honour to advise the Honourable House of Representatives that on the 19th day of October 2018, a bill entitled An Act to Validate and Confirm as Lawful the Financial Institutions Vesting of Assets in Pan-Caribbean Merchant Bank Limited Order 2000, dated the 6th day of June 2000, and for connected matters, was passed in the Senate without amendment. Signed, Thomas Tavares Finson, QC, CDJP, President of the Senate.
Mr. Hutchison.
Mr. Speaker, I now ask for your consent that the Senate amendments to the bill entitled the Fishery Act 2018 be now considered and approved.
Those in favor? Those against? As of it.
Mr. Speaker, I now ask that the Senate amendments to the Fishery Act 2018 be now considered.
Those in favor? Those against? As of it. Petitions? Papers? Reports from committees.
Mr. Speaker, I now lay on the table of the House a copy of the report of the special report of the Sessional Select Committee of the House of Representatives on Infrastructure and Physical Development on the motion regarding the construction industry policy.
Mr. Speaker, if I may, I'm a little disappointed that the chairman of the PAAC is not here to take the last remaining report on the order paper. He's on his way. We might have run out of time, but nonetheless, if he comes in time, we'd love him to have it, because I gave an undertaking that we would move all of these reports off of the order table so that we become current. And we are now current to the point where when this is taken, there will be nothing left from the PAAC to discuss in Parliament.
Mr. Speaker,
Let's have some order, please.
Is the House ready to take the report of the Sessional Select Committee on Human Resources and Social Development on private members' motion number 12 of 2017, which is on your order paper?
That motion again. Mr. Semuda, would you, Mr. Semuda, would you advise?
It will be taken under public business today, Mr. Speaker.
Yes.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Semuda.
Yes. Mr. Speaker, we had intended to take the Bank of Jamaica Amendments Act 2018 today, but the opposition spokesman or the spokesman from the opposition who would... It's not that one that you're going to take. Oh, no, it's yours. I'm sorry. My apologies. Mr. Speaker, the Bank of Jamaica Amendments Act 2018 will now be taken by the Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House, I'll move to introduce and have read a first time a bill shortly entitled the Bank of Jamaica Amendment Act 2018. Mr. Speaker, I further beg to give notice that at a later stage today, I'll move for the suspension of the standing orders to enable me to take first and second readings of this bill and for me to refer it to a special select committee of this House, which shall sit jointly with a similar committee to be appointed by the Senate to consider and report on the bill.
Those in favor?
Mr. Speaker.
Just a minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I'd indicated. Go ahead.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House, I will move the following motion. Be it resolved that the report of the special report of the Sessional Select Committee of the House of Representatives on the infrastructure and physical development on the motion regarding the construction industry policy, which was laid on the table of the House on the 23rd day of October 2018, be approved.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice at the next meeting of the House. I'll move the following motion. Be it resolved that the Auditor General's Department Performance Audit Report and the Student Loans Bureau Loan Management, which was laid on the table of the House on the 18th day of September 2018, be referred to the Public Accounts Committee of the House of Representatives for consideration and report.
Questions and answers to questions. Mr. Bunting.
May I invite the Minister of Finance and Public Service to answer the question standing in my name?
Dr. Clark.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Bunting asked of me on the 9th of October. The member from Central Manchester asked of me on the 9th of October 2018 the following question. Will the Minister provide the following information on the amount of GCT collected from businesses with annual turnover in the following ranges? Less than $10 million, $10 million to $25 million, $25 million to $50 million. My response. For calendar year 2017, based on information from the Tax Administration Jamaica, the GCT collected from businesses with annual turnover less than $10 million is $2,494,677,655.52. the GCT collected by Tax Administration Jamaica for businesses with annual turnover between $10 million and $25 million is $1,872,508,403.90. The GCT collected by Tax Administration Jamaica from businesses with annual turnover between $25 million and $50 million is $2,995,364,905.01, which makes the total for the 2017 calendar for these groups $6,462,550,964.13.
Mr. Burton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, these questions are, of course, continuing a conversation which started between myself and the Minister. I am using it. Perhaps we could turn on a second one. Are you hearing me any better, Mr. Speaker? Go ahead. Yes, okay. Member from West Portland should stop chuckling over there. Please leave the speaker alone. Mr. Speaker, as I was started to say, this is really, these questions and the responses which the Minister has kindly provided is really continuing a conversation that started back in May, I think it was, during the sectoral debate, when we both agreed in principle that the idea of raising the threshold for GCT registration was a desirable thing in principle. The Minister, of course, being very cautious, didn't want to commit to anything ahead of us looking at the numbers. And I will say the numbers are interesting because what the Minister has said here, out of a total of about 13,000 businesses registered for GCT, 9,000, or roughly 70%, provide about in the region of 6% of the total revenues. So roughly 70% of the businesses only provide 6% rather of the total revenue, which is not surprising, by the way. As I recall, a study done a couple of years ago said 3% of the businesses pay 80% of the total. So this is consistent because this would suggest that, 30% of the businesses pay 90% of the total. So when you break it down on an average, Mr. Speaker, you see that businesses with a turnover below 10 million pay about 450,000 a year or 37,000 a month. Now, to get rid of almost half the registered taxpayers would reduce the bureaucracy in the system and really make life easier for those who wanted to not register. And that is the spirit that we've been pursuing this going along with. I'm not going to press the Minister here for commitment as to what he would raise the threshold to. Having looked at the numbers and us having discussed it outside of, in our sidebar earlier, I think we agree that it is a complex issue and it requires careful study. But I think in principle, the agreement is that we can look at some modest raising of the threshold, and I look forward to, by the next budget, the Minister being in a position to do that and to make life easier, particularly for our MSME sector. Thank you.
Thank you to the member of Central Manchester. The data suggests that most of the businesses in Jamaica are indeed small businesses. As the member mentioned, approximately 75% of them have sales less than 50 million. And those businesses, as I mentioned earlier, contribute GCT to the government coffers. Clearly, the position that the government of Jamaica is in, every $1 billion matters. The the principle, as the member mentioned, of finding a way to gradually and modestly, to use your words, member, increase the threshold is something that we're open to, but it has to be, as you mentioned, very carefully considered. The issues to be considered include not only how much we get from those businesses on a net basis, but also the impact of not requiring businesses of a enlarged threshold to not register would also mean that those businesses now would be not, in addition to not being required to charge output taxes, they would be able, if they so choose, to claim refunds on input taxes. And that number is harder to estimate, and that is why one would have to be very cautious in how the adjustment is made. The other thing to consider is that because the GCT rate is at 16.5%, as opposed to what it could be if it were on a much broader base, it could be much lower, but because it's 16.5%, the incentive for people who do not have an obligation to file output taxes or to collect output taxes, the incentive for them is to file for a refund, because 16.5 is, if they're paying that on their input, is just too much to give up. If the number were substantially lower, then people could give it up. And therefore, while the purpose might be to reduce the complexity, in fact, you don't end up reducing the complexity because businesses are incentivized to file so they can collect a refund on the input tax, even if they're not required to file for the output composition of it. And that is born in the reality today, that even though the threshold is 3 million and we have lots of businesses with revenues less than 3 million, and they're not required to charge GCT on their sales, many of them still register and still file. Over the records show that nearly 3,000 of them, because they want to collect the input tax at 16.5%. And so yes, it would be a desirable goal to reduce complexity, but the level of GCT keeps people in the system because they want a refund. But it's an objective that I'll continue to work with a member from Central Manchester on, and I thank him for his question.
Mr. Tweed.
Mr. Speaker, the expiry of 21 days. May I be permitted to ask the following questions, first to the Honourable Minister of Transport, then to the Honourable Minister of Health, and to the Minister of Education through the Leader of the House.
Motions that may be made at the commencement of public business requiring notice. Motions relating to the sittings of the House. Motions for leave to introduce bills. Presentation of bills without leave of the House first obtained. Public business. Mr. Samuda.
Mr. Speaker, I now move for the suspension of the standing orders to allow me to take the first and second readings of the bill, notice of which I gave notice of earlier, and to refer it to a special select committee of the House, which, like I said earlier, will sit jointly with a similar committee to be appointed by the Senate to consider and report on the bill.
Those in favor? Those against? As of it.
Mr. Speaker, I now move to introduce and have read a first time a bill shortly entitled the Bank of Jamaica Amendment Act 2018.
Go.
A bill shortly entitled the Bank of Jamaica Amendment Act 2018 read a first time.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice of a second reading of the bill. Mr. Speaker, this bill, the Bank of Jamaica Amendment Bill, is a very important bill, a simple bill, very short by comparison, relatively speaking, but it's a bill that seeks to modernize the central bank, the Bank of Jamaica, in keeping with international best practices. The central bank represents our collective savings, and for any country, a central bank is a crucial institution. The bill, Mr. Speaker, seeks to improve the governance of the central bank, to strengthen and deepen the governance, and very importantly, seeks to introduce transparency to monetary policy decisions and monetary policy actions of the central bank. The bill seeks to clarify the mandate of the central bank, and it seeks to give the central bank autonomy and independence in law in the implementation of monetary policy. The bill also seeks to ensure that the central bank is adequately capitalized at all times, with a dynamic capitalization provision that if the central bank's capital falls below prescribed levels, and the levels are prescribed by a ratio to their monetary liabilities, then the bank would be capitalized, and if the capital rises above a certain level, then distributions will be paid to the government of Jamaica. And the bill also seeks to have, by law, measures of accountability and to pivot the accountability relationship from the Minister of Finance and to the Parliament. Mr. Speaker, the historical background is one with which we're very familiar. Jamaica has suffered over an extended period of time, over maybe, one could argue over 40 years, we have struggled with high inflation. And over a particular period in the 1990s and the 2000s, we had extremely high inflation that extended for a long time. And it was accompanied by high debt and periods of chronic instability. Mr. Speaker, during those periods, we had what we describe in Jamaica as the fiscal component dominating the monetary, and monetary policy and the central bank had to pursue policies that took into consideration the government's fragile fiscal position. Mr. Speaker, Jamaica has benefited from a sustained fiscal efforts under two consecutive administrations that has introduced a measure of macroeconomic stability for which all Jamaicans are happy and for which we all are grateful. And it's on the back of those reforms that have brought a measure of stability that this bill is now being tabled. But Mr. Speaker, the seeds of this move would have been planted a very long time ago. I recall I was on the board of the Central Bank in 2010, and as a member of the board back then, when Jamaica was under a standby arrangement, moving towards central bank independence or monetary policy independence was something that we'd have been working on from then. The policy positions would have come to the board because it was a part of the standby arrangement as a goal. In the last administration, very big steps were made with the 2014 amendment to the Bank of Jamaica and Banking Services Act, which gave the Bank of Jamaica the responsibility, the very important responsibility for financial system stability, and also gave the central bank autonomy or independence in supervisory matters. Prior to 2014, the Minister of Finance would have been the ultimate authority in supervisory matters. But with that bill in 2014, that was changed, and matters are within the purview of the central bank. And I know that the previous Minister of Finance would have given thought to where we are today, which is to introduce more deeper institutional reforms to ensure that the central bank is modernized in keeping with our economic objectives. Coming into this administration, when we entered into the precautionary standby arrangement with the IMF in October 2016, this policy would have been a central feature of that agreement, and we'd have signed on to it from then, and it has taken us until now to put this bill in place, but more importantly, not so much the bill, but to ensure that the central bank is ready. And those policy changes would have been made over the past 24 months. Mr. Speaker, I have spoken a lot about economic independence, the ability for Jamaica to chart its own course without undue reliance on the international community for basic needs. Mr. Speaker, the means by which we can achieve that cherished goal of economic independence is by building strong and durable institutions, of which a strong central bank is key. The aim of this reform, Mr. Speaker, is to institutionalize. We're now benefiting from a period of low inflation. The purpose of the reform is to ensure that we institutionalize low, stable, and predictable inflation indefinitely. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, as a single reform, as a single legislation, this represents one of the more important reforms that we would have done when we're completed during this period of reform. Mr. Speaker, I will have an opportunity to thank all of those who contributed at the end of the process, but I must even now thank the persons who helped to get the bill to this stage, the persons from the Bank of Jamaica, from the Ministry of Finance, from the Attorney General's Chambers, from the Ministry of Justice, from the Chief Parliamentary Counsel's Office, and technical advice from the International Monetary Fund. Mr. Speaker, I see this as a national project, as a continuation of building national institutions that can serve all Jamaica. And as a result, Mr. Speaker, I think it important and wish for the bill to be examined by a joint select committee of both Houses of Parliament, but before it can be referred to this committee, it must be read a second time. So I now move, Mr. Speaker, that the bill be read a second time.
Mr. Golden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as the Minister has indicated, this piece of legislation tabled today and about to be referred to a joint select committee represents another important step in the modernizing of the financial architecture of the country. We are coming from a place in which the country's finances have been dominated by the effect of high indebtedness, and that has required significant focus and sacrifice on the part of the Jamaican people and commitment from successive governments to bring that under control. The embodiment of the effort to bring it under control is perhaps the so-called fiscal rules that have been enshrined in law in our Financial Administration and Audit Act, setting out in law certain key targets which are to be met over the years to come. This particular piece of legislation involves another, obviously related piece, because in economic matters everything affects everything else, but it is an important element of it, dealing with monetary policy, the creation of money, the setting of the price of money in the form of interest rates, and the controlling of the rate at which money depreciates through inflation. These are important matters, and we very much look forward to a robust, sober, and well thought out constructive debate in the Joint Select Committee on the provisions of this bill. The common objective being to ensure that we place the Bank of Jamaica on the right footing for the future, to the extent that we are embarking on major reforms of key aspects of their mandate. The singularity of their mandate being the controlling of inflation within whatever parameters are set by the elected officials of the country is an important focal point. It in of itself may be controversial. The Federal Reserve, for example, does not have a singular commitment to that, but looks at other issues such as employment generation and achieving full employment as another aspect of their mandate. But we are, as I understand it, and I've obviously not yet read this bill, which was just tabled, but I understand that we are going to be focusing on inflation targeting as the primary or principal mandate of the central bank. Mr. Speaker, as has been said, the decision to go down this particular pathway is not a new decision. It has, the previous Minister of Finance in the last administration indicated that this was a policy issue to which he was committed at the time, and preparatory work had been undertaken, which has continued and reached the point where legislation is actually being brought here. So it represents a continuity of policy, which is important, but in these matters, often the devil is in the details, and it's important to get the details right, and we will look forward to participating in the national interest to ensure that that is done. And at this point, I would say that we look forward to the appointment of the Joint Select Committee, and hopefully we will be able to get through its work in timely fashion so that the legislation can be taken to the stage of actual enactment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Dr. Clark. You have to ask for the second reading. He did? Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, I now move, be it
a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Bank of Jamaica Act, read a second time. All right.
Mr. Speaker, I now move, be it resolved that this Honourable House appoint a special select committee comprising the following members: Dr. the Honourable Nigel Clark, the Honourable Delroy Chuck, the Honourable Floyd Green, the Honourable Favour Williams, those ordered to be reversed, please. The Honourable Delroy, Mr. Honourable Leslie Campbell, Mr. Peter Bunting, Dr. Wickham McNeil, Mr. Mark Golding, to sit jointly with a similar committee to be appointed by the Senate to consider and report on the bill shortly entitled the Bank of Jamaica Amendment Act 2018.
Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, I now move for the suspension of standing orders to enable me to take the motion notice which I gave earlier.
Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, I ask that the motion be approved.
Those in favor?
No, Mr. Speaker, I wish to speak on the motion, if I may. As I understand it, this is a motion which is seeking to refer to the Public Accounts Committee a report from the Auditor General on the Student Loan Bureau. Is that what we're discussing? Yes. I must say that it struck me as odd that we were going down this road, because my understanding of the standing orders and the conventions which support the standing orders would make this an unnecessary exercise. Standing Order 69, entitled Public Accounts Committee, in paragraph 1, sets out the various duties of the Public Accounts Committee in relation to examining the accounts showing the appropriation of sums granted by the legislature to meet expenditure, such other accounts as may be referred to the committee by the House or any other law, and the report of the Auditor General on any such accounts. Paragraph 2 says, all accounts and financial statements laid upon the table of the House in respect of statutory boards, public corporations, and public companies in which the government holds majority shares are deemed to be automatically referred to the Public Accounts Committee for examination and report. This is a deeming provision and deems these reports to have been referred to the Public Accounts Committee once they're laid in the House. So the practice has been, as far as I know, and based on discussions with my colleagues who have been in this chamber longer than I have, that the matter of the Public Accounts Committee's agenda and work is really worked out between the Chairman and the Auditor General based on the reports that she has sent to Parliament, and that the deeming provision is what makes that so. Therefore, I know that my friend and colleague who moved this motion is an enthusiast when it comes to the standing orders, but I suspect that his enthusiasm is not matched by his understanding of the standing orders on this particular issue. And I therefore query the relevance of this motion and the necessity for it, and would indicate that to the extent that it presages a new approach to how the Public Accounts Committee is vested with the work that it does, it is not consistent with the past conduct of the Public Accounts Committee, or indeed the way in which this House has dealt with the Public Accounts Committee's work. And I therefore would register my protest at the procedure we're now embarking upon.
Mr. Speaker,
I need to. Mr. Speaker, yes, I want to join in support of the member for South St. Andrew in relation to this matter, but there are some other issues affecting other committees that the government seem hell-bent on unraveling against the best wishes of this country. Mr. Speaker, there is a saying, if it ain't broke, don't need to fix it. And in relation to the PAC, Mr. Speaker, please. Mr. Speaker, in relation to the PAC, which is a long-standing committee that has operated by virtue of the rules here and convention. Right. There is no need to refer any such matter to the PAC. But I want to go further, because there are sessional select committees of this Parliament, including the PAAC, including the internal and external committee, and as a member mentioned PAAC. The PAAC is not only governed by the standing orders, but also specific provisions in the law that deals with fiscal responsibility. And, Mr. Speaker, there is no need to refer any matter to the PAC apart from the fact that the budget that is tabled in this Parliament that we pass comes within the total framework of appropriations and accountability.
Mr. Philip, Mr.
Yes.
Paulwell, could you hold a minute?
You don't want to hear me?
Could you hold a minute?
You want me to hold?
Could you wait a minute?
Okay, okay.
Could you sit a minute? Let me have some conference.
I will yield until I...
Yield, yes, yes.
Mr. Speaker.
No. He's not the thing.
I want to deal with it.
About law.
I'm going to ask members to recognize Minister Bartlett and Mr. Daly. The Speaker is about to address you. I'm going to ask you to recognize that the House is still in session. That when you want to speak, you should speak through the Speaker. We also have some students who are learning and want to learn about parliamentary affairs. I'm going to ask both sides to recognize that. We are having some consultation, and I would like members to still recognize that the House is still in session.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the controversy that has arisen, or the misunderstanding.
The leader of government business is on the floor.
The misunderstanding.
Addressing the Speaker. Proceed.
The misunderstanding that has arisen perhaps would have been easily avoided had the matter brought to the attention of the member earlier. Because in discussing the matter, and he's having a closer look at the provision, he is quite satisfied that the matter is deemed to be referred to the Public Accounts Committee. So it is not necessary to carry the House through this process.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the House Leader for his response.
Dr. Paulwell,
yes.
I am going to ask you.
Yes.
We don't have a motion to be debated.
Yes.
I'm therefore going to ask you, could you hold your comment?
Yes, but Mr. Speaker, I want to commend the House Leader on the position that has just been taken. But as I indicated to him, this matter goes beyond just the PAC, and that there is need for urgent consultation with himself and myself to resolve.
So, Paul, you're a senior parliamentarian.
Mr. Speaker, are you hearing what I'm saying?
I'm going to ask.
Are you hearing what I'm saying, Mr. Speaker?
Please do not have a debate on a matter that is not before us.
It's not a debate. It's not a debate.
There are some other issues. You're going to initiate response.
Mr. Speaker.
You're going to initiate response.
No. The leader of government business
yes.
and myself, we just, when we were there,
mentioned that there are some other issues related to the same point but affecting other committees, and that he and I really ought to deal with rather than having a brawl in this way.
Will you deal with when it comes?
Mr. Speaker, that matter is not properly before the House.
Okay.
I wonder if the member heard me. It is not properly before the House, and as such, it does not need.
So you're withdrawing the motion?
We will meet at another place and discuss it, where both sides can contend and come to a conclusion.
Yeah, but Mr. Speaker, I'd like an undertaking from the House Leader that in the meantime, committees are meeting tomorrow, and for the last 3 or 4 times where sessional select committees have met, the government members have attempted to frustrate the committees from entering upon the reference.
Mr. Bunting.
And since
Mr. Bunting, please have a seat.
I'm speaking on the motion, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Bunting.
A motion was put, it has not been withdrawn. I am speaking on the motion.
Please have a seat, Mr. Bunting. The Speaker is on his feet. You have a seat.
Carefully now.
Members, this matter is not properly before the House. And I'm not going to entertain a debate on this matter at this time. If you wish to debate the matter, take a resolution before the House. Mr. Samuda, will you proceed, please?
What? Mr. Speaker, I'm not too sure what we have just done. I thought we were to vote. I thought we were to vote on a motion, and that has not been put as yet. So the member is quite right in speaking on the motion.
Thank you. The motion has not been withdrawn, and I am speaking. House Leader, would you allow me to finish? The motion was not withdrawn at this point, and I'm speaking on the motion, as I have a right to do under the standing orders. And I am pointing out, House Leader, because you have not been on these committees, so I'm bringing it to your attention. In fact, the matter has even attracted the attention of the former Prime Minister Bruce Golding, who wrote a letter to the newspaper pointing out how ridiculous it was for the position of some members, and I'm not going to call any names, but I'm looking in their direction, to attempt to frustrate the work of this Parliament in providing oversight to the executive. And when a former Prime Minister from that side has to call them out, I said to those members, have you no shame? Have you no shame? This goes beyond a partisan short-term advantage. This is a very fundamental principle under the Westminster parliamentary system which we have adopted. So, Mr. Speaker, I am asking the House Leader for his undertaking on behalf of members on that side that we're not going to come to committee tomorrow. There are these 2 committees meeting tomorrow. We're not going to come to committee and go through the pantomime that we've gone through for the last 3 or 4 meetings with some members believing they're part of a circus and just attempting to frustrate the work of the committees. I would like that undertaking, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Samuda, proceed on the item.
First of all, I would caution the member. To be more discreet with the language he uses to describe the activities of the government members on committees. We are all elected here as equals, representing the interests of the people who elected us. in whatever form they wish to present their representation, it is their right so to do. Okay. Now, on the question of the meetings, Mr. Speaker, I have been on many in my 38 years here. And I can assure you that in almost every instance, and I will go one step further to illustrate how vividly pertinent what I'm saying is, when the now chairman of the opposition party and I sat on the Economy and Production Committee to deal with bank charges. I chaired the committee. And the member, when I set a date for a discussion to be held, the member wrote me and chastised me for attempting to set a date without the concurrence of the entire team. Say the member there, ask him. Say the member there, ask him. Ask him. So you can't have it both ways. No, hold on. Hold on. The fact is that it is, and I relented. Hello, you will recall that I relented. And you will recall that the decision was taken with the now General Secretary of that opposition party, who also was part of that committee. I relented and acceded to the wishes of the committee to have a concurrence as to what is to be taken and when. Now, what is the relevance? Let me tell it what. Let me tell you what it is. The fact that you chair a committee does not give you authority to convene when you want, and does not give you the authority to set the agenda.
So you're trying to justify
the agenda. That is the relevance. The agenda is set by the entire team. Don't
Mr. Speaker, on a point of order. On a point of order, Mr. Speaker. On a point of order, Mr. Speaker.
You have no point of order. Sit down.
Mr. Speaker.
I'm not yielding because you know what I'm saying is gospel. Don't bother come with no point of order.
Minister, the member is standing on a point of order.
You know, there's a thing, Mr. Speaker, that says you must not waste the time of the court. Don't waste the time of
Mr. Speaker, on a point of order.
Mr. Samuda, could you turn your mic off and could you do? Before you stand on your point, before you state the point of order.
Mr. Speaker,
before you state the point of order.
The member made some comments.
I want to remind members that this matter that is being debated in this House by both the leader of government business and yourself is not before me as a resolution. I will not permit a debate on this matter at this time. I'm going to ask you to,
Mr. Speaker, you have not heard my point of order.
Set your state's point of order and that the House will carry it to an end. It is not a resolution. It cannot be accepted for a debate.
Mr. Speaker,
if you want to do so, bring a resolution. Let's debate it in full.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not...
State your point of order.
I will. Mr. Speaker, the member made some comments attributed to me which were not factual. The Speaker made a remark which was not factual. And therefore he is misleading the House. And I request that he withdraw those comments that he made alluding to my communication with him then.
Mr. Jackson, Mr. Jackson, for the Speaker's point, could you state what he has said to mislead the House?
He made statements regarding letter that I wrote to him. in a previous committee.
Please.
He made statements regarding letter that I wrote to him in a previous committee of this House. Contents to which he referred was not correct in its totality, and therefore it amounts to a misleading of the House on the matter. And therefore, if the member wish to continue along that line, let him present that letter before the House.
Mr. Semudo,
Mr. Speaker,
I'm going to ask you to answer and close the matter.
Mr. Speaker, many of us have been here a long time, and many of us are now, it's well into the evening. But Mr. Speaker, the one thing that we must all be mindful of as we get a little older in life is not to engage in futility. To ask me to withdraw is a total act of futility. It's nonsense. So it is neither a sensible, request nor a point of order. So let us move on with sensible matters, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Semudo. Mr. Semudo, next, could you proceed with the next item, please?
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, I remember that when you begged me. Mr. Speaker, I won't say for what.
Let us have some order in the House, please.
Mr. Speaker, I now move for the suspension of standing orders to enable private members' motion to be taken today, as it is it is part of the standing orders that it be taken on a Wednesday. But today we are having a number of private members' motions that will be taken, Mr. Speaker.
Those in favour? Those against?
Hello.
Members, you're in the House, and I would like you to listen and participate.
Today, I'm going to call on the, firstly, I'm going to call on the, or invite you to call on the Chairman of the Public Administration and Appropriations Committee to take the matter that we discussed last week. And he gave an undertaking that he was anxious to have the matters put behind him.
Mr. Speaker, I came...
Dr. McNeil.
Yes, I came to take those reports, and the summary and everything was done to present today. I called the supervisor for the committees and was told that they had been informed it was not being taken and took back the reports and summaries. I've sent them to ask them to bring them. If they can bring them over, I can take them later. If not, we can do it next week.
All right, Mr. Speaker, it's raining outside, so it's a beautiful time to have a good debate inside. So, the House, Mr. Speaker, will continue the debate on the motion number 28 by the member from Southern Trelawney. Her motion was tabled in the House at the last sitting, and I invite members, or request that you invite members to participate in the debate, failing which she is prepared to close.
Mr. Treat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to associate myself with the sentiments expressed by the member for Southern Trelawney in the motion number 28, which for our visitors and for our own memory has to do with the remuneration of retired judges of the Supreme Court and the Court of Appeal. It ought to be clearly remembered that the capacity of these officers to have additional employment after their retirement is severely limited. Many of them undertake some measure of consultative practice, but it is undoubted that that has to be done with a great deal of discretion and restraint, which very often causes a diminution of the economic rewards that would otherwise attach to their legal practice. They, therefore, are placed in a situation where the ravages of inflation and depreciating currency undermine the pensions that they receive, while they are, by discretion and by tradition, limited from alternative earnings. Imagine, too, Mr. Speaker, the unique position of legal officers in these categories. They have adjudicated upon very controversial matters. Very often they have been exposed to criminal elements in the society, and therefore there's a measure, if not of peril, certainly of vulnerability on the part of these officers. And therefore they require and deserve the consideration set out by the motion for assured compensation. The problem, of course, is a broader one, Mr. Speaker, because almost everyone in the public service has had their retiring remunerations, the purchasing power, severely diminished over the last several years. Many have been able to, by dint of other occupations, supplement that. But it is by no means an even process, and it creates an invidious situation, because clearly, you don't want, nor would it be seemly for retired judges to be appealing for assistance and for consideration for employment after the dignity of their office that they have engaged in over time. There's another aspect of it too, Mr. Speaker, and it has to do with health insurance. Health expenses usually constitute upwards of 60% of the expenses of retired persons over a certain age. And while it is true, as the motion indicates, that longevity is increasing, so also are the measures necessary to ensure a reasonable quality of life during these later years. And Mr. Speaker, the difficulty and the inadequacy of health insurance coverage and the expense of it when you are an older person, a senior citizen, undermines even the limitations of the efforts of the amounts that you have, that you do receive. And Mr. Speaker, in that regard, I'd like to point out that the peril is experienced also by members of this Honourable House who are nonetheless public servants. And in the consideration of this motion, it is not asking for any special favor to point out what you, I think, know, Mr. Speaker, and the leaders of the House will. How many times do retired parliamentarians, even at the level of Deputy Prime Minister, have to come and make representations to Cabinet for the relief of their health expenses? Inflation, depreciation of the currency, all of these things play havoc, and they increase costs, absolutely increase costs of these facilities because of improved technology and more expensive procedures. So, Mr. Speaker, I am fully in support of the motion that has been put forward. I'm inviting the Honourable House to go beyond, to consider going beyond even the remit of this resolution, especially in the area of health coverage. It is unfair and unjust for persons who have served in the public sector not to have at least the option of continuing excellent health cover. Yes? And I seek your leave, Mr. Speaker, to go beyond and to say that the level of health cover now that government servants, including ourselves, are part of is not adequate. It's really not adequate, even for sitting members, let alone its availability and adequacy for those who have left. And so, Mr. Speaker, I'm hoping that you will, that other members of the House will give fulsome support to this. One of the prayers is that whereas judges lose their health insurance benefits upon retirement, at a time when increasing age often increases the necessity for such health insurance coverage. This is a very significant point, as also is the question of the disparity between those who have retired some time ago and those versus the entitlements of those who are in service now. Mr. Speaker, we do not save money or appear to be prudent when we disadvantage those who have served us well. And Mr. Speaker, it is very important that we in this House stop this artificial and false shyness by not ensuring that we, who also give significant public service on both sides, should also be mindful of the reasonable needs not only of ourselves but of our families who undergo significant sacrifice because we forego earnings in our professional lives and also in our prospects for future earnings. That must be put on the agenda, and I pray that the honourable member and indeed the leadership of the House on both sides will see to that as we go forward. May it please you.
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to be very brief, and it is just to refer to a matter that I have raised before with the former Minister of Finance, and that has to do with the pension arrangement for drivers. Mr. Speaker, I really want to urge, as our drivers get older and cannot continue, it is really a shame that many of them have to depart without something in place for them that is reasonable. And I'm going to urge now, in the context of this debate, the Minister of Finance to try as quickly as possible to address the situation of the drivers. May it please you.
Mr. Speaker, I really want to, with your permission, I really rise to give support to the leader of opposition business intervention regarding the drivers. And these affect drivers for all of us, members of parliament, who have served for, in many instances, decades. And they would have reached to the point that they have to leave the service and there's no provision for them. Quite frankly, I find it regrettable and unfortunate. We have had similar experience in the past regarding one set of public sector workers, mainly in hospitals and in schools, who were employed by the school board, and there were no provision for them after serving for 20, 30 years and going to retirement. I believe, Mr. Speaker, and through you to the Minister, that we must find a way to make a provision for these persons who have served diligently in that capacity, serve us to perform our duties in this House, and we should not allow that to happen to them. And I dare to say, while I'm on the floor, on my feet, that we should seek to even make it retroactive to some period for some who have left without such provision and have to dwell in very, very, very unfortunate circumstances. They have served this parliament in those capacities, and I think it's our moral duty to ensure that we don't leave them to go into retirement in the state that we have. And I really, really crave the indulgence of my colleagues.
Mr. Speaker, with respect to the comment or the suggestion made by the member from East Kingston and Port Royal and the member from St. Catherine South, those are good suggestions that I'll take a look at with a view to seeing the feasibility. and we'll see what can happen. There are aberrations in the system. The policy of the government is to have as many people as possible covered by pensions. We'll be coming with amendments to the private pension bill next year. Most people in Jamaica who are employed in the private sector. Of the 1.3 million people employed, 1.2 million of them work in the private sector. So what we want to do as a matter of policy is, and in the national interest of Jamaica, increasing the social safety net and the provisions for people post-retirement, is to increase the penetration of pensions. To do that, we have to make it more attractive for people to save towards a pension. The bill that we just introduced, member, is crucial in that. For years, people have not considered saving to be an attractive option. And indeed, saving is not an attractive option when inflation is in double digits and out of control. Why should you save? Your money is going to be worth less tomorrow. You're better off spending it today. So everything, all the policies work together. And as we move to entrench and institutionalize a low, stable, and predictable inflationary environment, we expect that the incentive to save will be higher. We expect that the amendments to private pension that we will put into place next year, that will attract more people to pension products, and we will increase the penetration and therefore make Jamaica a more robust place. There are gaps in the system. There are, commissions of parliament, for example. They're paid gratuities in lieu of pension, right? So with the pension bill that we passed last year, where we replaced 32 separate pieces of legislation, what happened in Jamaica is that every time a new cadre of persons came on stream, you'd create a pension for them. Pension for the fire people, a pension for the teachers, pension for the police, and we had 30 pieces of legislation which we collapsed into one. The next phase is to look at people who are outside and see what the best solution ought to be. And it's not surprising that drivers who are connected to the parliament are outside. Commissions of parliament are also outside, whether it's INDECOM or the political ombudsman's office and so on. They're outside of the general civil service arrangement. And there is historical reason for that. But that historical reason is not an obstacle or a barrier. But we just need to look at it holistically.
Mr. Speaker, we ask that you authorize the suspension of the debate on this motion for further discussions, and also the member, I'm advised the member is amenable to have it referred to a joint select committee for deliberation and report. So she may rise and so advise you.
Yes. Those against? The House is suspended this time. Sorry, the motion. Sorry, the motion is suspended.
Is the chairman of the... All right. Your information isn't there yet. All right, Mr. Speaker, I would now invite the member from Central Kingston to continue the debate on private member's motion number 31, seeking the approval of the House for the adoption of the report on the sessional Select Committee on Human Resources and Social Development. So, Mr. Speaker, the private member's motion number 12 of 2017, which was laid on the table of the House on the 12th day of September 2017. Would the member proceed to take that now?
Mr. Tweed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will. Mr. Speaker, some 2 years ago, I raised a private member's motion in this House, indeed not 2 years ago, a year and some months, regarding Jamaica's progress towards the reform of our law and our practices to do with harmful smoking, whether of tobacco or any other substance. And I'm pleased to report today that, to remind the House that there was a robust debate on the matter in those times, and the matter referred to the Human Resources and Social Development Commission, which sat on the 6th and 12th of September last year, 1 year and 1 month ago, Mr. Speaker, and dealt with this matter. Mr. Speaker, your committee received submissions from the Ministry of Health, the National Council on Drug Abuse, the Cannabis License Authority, the Jamaica Coalition for Tobacco Control, the Heart Foundation of Jamaica, the Jamaica Cancer Society, and also from Carreras Limited. And we noted that there's a significant increase in the number of young Jamaicans who are still smoking. It's at the time 11%. Later information beyond the time that this committee sat indicates, in fact, that the number is higher, and that this was unfortunately a significant cause of chronic diseases and great expense and personal suffering in Jamaica. Mr. Speaker, one of the things that the committee noted, and which I wish to bring to the attention of the House today, is that there was a commitment reported by the Minister of Health and the National Council of Drug Abuse for $40 million to be allocated in tranches of $4 million a month over a period of 10 months to introduce a program using social media as well as traditional media to educate young people on the impacts of smoking. And I would like to know whether, in fact, that has been continued, and if it has, is there any indication of its success? You know, Mr. Speaker, we're fooling around this thing, perhaps not intentionally. Driving on the North Coast Highway this past weekend, I noticed a large billboard telling people that, advertising to all passers-by, that Cravenay was part of the good life. This is directly flouting Jamaica's commitments, and we must stop doing this. The power of the tobacco lobby, the fact that they give generous charitable contributions, have all softened and, I dare say, compromised some of the strong advocacy that we need to exercise on this matter. I particularly yield to my colleague, the member from Eastern St. Thomas, who, among all of us in this House, has championed the cause of tobacco moderation. Yes? And one of the provisions and recommendations of the report, of your committee's report, is that the tobacco control legislation should be in place in short order. The recommendations fulsomely were that there should be an increase in the Ministry of Health's budget for the 2018-2019 financial year for programs centered on educating persons, especially young people, on the dangers of smoking tobacco and ganja. And if it so pleases the Minister to respond, he would be able to tell us whether that in fact is so. And that further, that there be detailed research that could be done to estimate the number of smoking cessation medications that could be made available, that there be greater enforcement of the public health tobacco control regulations of 2013, and of greatest importance, Mr. Speaker, that comprehensive tobacco control legislation be promulgated in short order. Mr. Speaker, it's extremely significant that or ought to be, that the work of the sessional committees of Parliament be taken very, very seriously. Please bear in mind, Mr. Speaker, what the public don't really know, that Standing Order 26A enjoins that the report, such as being presented here today, if it is approved by the House, I quote, shall within 21 days of the tabling of such approval make a submission to Cabinet inviting their consideration of the subject matter of the motion as approved by the House. And further, that a Cabinet decision in response to a submission made pursuant to paragraph 2 shall be tabled in the House not later than 21 days after being made. Mr. Speaker, could you help me, sir? How many times are these provisions, those particular provisions, observed? And I would particularly ask that they be observed in this instance. Apropos that, Mr. Speaker, in order, quite simply, to encourage what I know is the commitment of the Minister of Health, and I believe the entire government, to effective tobacco control, I have, on the order paper, asked questions recently of the Minister of Health as to what stage we have reached. They're not ready for answer yet, or not due for answer, but it is part of a parcel of what I consider to be a very appropriate campaign. May I change that word, sir? An appropriate crusade to ensure that in the midst of financial difficulties and all of the other constraints of our time, we do those things that can improve the quality of life of our people, that do not require expenditure, heavy money, but rather involve the concerted will and good example of this Honourable House. It is with these remarks that I present the report of the Human Resources and Social Development Committee of the House to the full House today in relation to motion number 12 of 2017. With regret that it has taken so long to reach this point, but nonetheless with satisfaction that I believe we have the commitment to carry this matter through to completion. May it please you.
Dr. Tufton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just briefly to say to the member, given his reference to public health and in particular to tobacco consumption and the need for greater levels of public awareness and control, given the public health concerns.
Dr. Tufton, we have improved the mic system so that the answer can hear you.
I fully understand that the answer is
will you
trying
speak in the mic so that we all can participate?
Okay, Mr. Speaker, let me shout to ensure that you are properly, that all concerned can hear. Mr. Speaker, just to say briefly that I share, and we on this side certainly share the members' concern as it relates to tobacco use, abuse, and its public health impact. And you referenced a few initiatives, one being the public education program, which I announced back in my sectoral, which in fact was carried out. Some 50 million, I believe, was spent, which led to a major program that involved social media, which was primarily targeting the school population, the younger age cohort from 11 to 15, 16. It had also included visits and activations at various locations, both where this age cohort congregates, so both at the level of the school campuses, but also in other activities where that population could be reached. The preliminary results, because the campaign ended recently, are suggesting that there was significant reach in terms of the population that was targeted as it relates to the messaging. There is some further work needed in terms of impact, whether or not it has changed behavior. That's kind of difficult to assess in a very precise way, but certainly in terms of persons being aware of the dangers of smoking at that age. It requires continuation, and there's no doubt that as we attempt to raise awareness and to discourage behavior of this type, the marketing companies, the tobacco companies, spend quite a bit of money countering and asserting themselves towards getting more of their products out there. And therefore it requires vigilance, it requires active and continuous work in this regard. The legislation which you mentioned is key to controlling the extent to which the tobacco companies can have access and can use that access to influence usage. And I agree with you that the comprehensive legislation is long overdue. But I will say that we are committed and indeed are working on ensuring that we can table this piece of legislation, this comprehensive piece of legislation, not likely this year, this calendar year, but certainly in the next calendar year. And I know you have heard it over and over. And I know other members are concerned. My colleague directly to my opposite, who has done a lot in this area, has asked the same questions. But I assure you that the government is seized with the need to move forward on it, and we're working together to ensure that it be done. And that will add significant restrictions in terms of the advertising that you speak of, and other restrictions on the marketing companies, and hopefully will bring some relief to the vulnerable groups that are there and are likely to be vulnerable to the influences. Thank you.
Dr. Ferguson. Dr. Ferguson, is it that your mic, use the other one? We're not hearing you well. I know you're tall, but you got to speak to it.
Are you hearing me now?
Very clearly.
You seem to hear clearly on the second time, Mr. Speaker. What I'm saying, Mr. Speaker, is that essentially the tobacco control regulations of 2015, the problem we have had is really enforcement, which is a police matter, but has to be agitated by the critical stakeholders. In the earlier phase, we had asked, after meetings with the High Command, that they should be, holding as much as possible prosecution. Where we are now, I think we have to be more vigilant, and the discussion with the High Command, because I know we are working, Mr. Speaker, on the comprehensive bill. Much of that work was completed before we left government. In fact, it is one of the best examples of an all-of-government approach, with Foreign Affairs chairing that committee and all the other critical ministries, trade, health, etc., was involved. What we are asking for, and this is why I will await when you are having the discussion, responding to the member from Central Kingston on the motion that is now before us relates to the comprehensive bill. But that is a bill that we must bring to the fore, because there are some critical articles of the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, especially Article 13, 15, and 16, that must be addressed if we are to get the desired outcome relative to tobacco control. So I look forward to that opportunity, Minister.
Mr. Shemuda.
Mr. Speaker, may I thank both the Minister of Health and the member from Eastern St. Thomas for their contributions, and may I invite you to put the motion to the House now for approval.
Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it. Members, will you now recognize Mr. Shemuda?
Mr. Speaker, we will now draw down the curtain on the motion that was brought by the member from West Rural St. Andrew, dealing with Offences Against a Person Act. It is not intended to close this debate today, but we are certainly hoping that there will be some contributions while we give the former Minister of Tourism and member from Central Westmoreland an opportunity to prepare his... Yeah, well, I think it's in fairness, we will allow those who wish to make a comment. I know the Minister of Health wishes to speak on this motion, and the opposition leader of opposition business also would like to make a contribution, and other members might want to make. So we'll try to get there, and then we will hopefully make a final decision on this motion next week when we convene. Thank you.
Mr. Paulwell.
Mr. Speaker, I intend to be brief, especially because I wasn't here at the start of the debate. But the member always speaks about his being here from time immemorial and hearing these things over and over and over. And in that regard, Mr. Speaker, I too have had to go through such a similar debate as this one. And there's a member here from Southeast Clarendon who was once Minister of Health. And he did preside over a joint select committee of this parliament that met between 2008 and 10, 16 times, 17 times. And a report was drafted, and it was subject to some amendments. But there is also, from all of that effort, a policy that was developed. So, with certain recommendations. So I'm wondering why, at this stage, having gone through that, having a joint position, why, and of course, right, there were many special interest groups, the churches and so on, they were all involved. And there appeared to be some consensus. Where is that? And why we can't just bring that to the fore and sign off on it and move forward? Right. So perhaps we could get some clarification on that, because I know it's unfinished.
I'll give you some guidance on it. The whole purpose of sending it to committee is that when you go to committee, you can review what had taken place before. And out of that, you might then be able to prepare a new report that would go to cabinet for decision. It's part, but this is a very significant matter. It's not an easy matter to resolve. So we will take that report into, because we are mindful of the existence of that report and the whole process that took place. So we will include it in any new, and the provisions in any new proposal that is brought to the House.
Mr. Speaker, there are several members who sat on that committee, and one of the reasons why I think the report was not tabled is that several recommendations were made to the draft report to be taken back to committee, but the committee never met again. And so we at the time, I know the report exists. I have it in soft copy and in hard copy, and those of us who sat on the committee know what the report actually says. So I would be guided by the House Leader as to how we proceed from here, because we met for 2 years, House Leader.
I thank you for that, but just to say that circumstances alter cases. And so we are in a different environment, and it is indeed, it has languished for so long that perhaps the time has come to really make some major decisions. But when the Minister of Health speaks, I'm sure he'll give us some guidance as to what his thoughts are and what process he intends to adopt.
Am I being?
Minister Tufton.
Mr. Speaker, thank you, and I thank the members and the Leader of Government Business for placing Mr. Speaker, I think the motion raised by my colleague as outlined on the 5th of June 2018 is relevant for revisiting, and I agree with what has been said just now and what she said earlier, that it requires attention, it is topical, and frankly speaking, long overdue for a firm decision one way or the other. She referenced a public opinion survey that was done just recently, a few months ago, where the public perception weighed in heavily on this discussion around abortion. And subsequent to that coverage in one of the leading daily newspapers, there were several other discussions that were triggered. And indeed, in my case as Minister of Health, a number of visits by stakeholder groups, either for or against. It is a topical issue, and it is an issue that generates significant emotions, as well as, from the public health standpoint, requires attention. For the benefit of the most recent discussions, Mr. Speaker, and in the interest of public education, despite the knowledge that a number of members in this House would have from the work that was done before, I'm going to ask for a few minutes just to state from a public health standpoint what the Ministry of Health's position is, and then make a quick recommendation, which I believe you will find in keeping with the thoughts that have been expressed so far. So, the Ministry of Health, Mr. Speaker, has a firm policy on saving lives and focuses on a family health approach aimed at reducing infant mortality, child and maternal mortality and morbidity, in keeping with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. In collaboration with a number of other ministries and agencies, Mr. Speaker, our programs focus on health and family life education, parenting education, and safe reproductive health. And these programs provide information and education for them to make informed decisions about their life. The abortion debate, Mr. Speaker, involves a complex set of legal, moral, religious, social, and cultural aspects. The current law is embodied in sections 72 and 73 of the Offences Against the Persons Act 1864, where section 72 makes it a felony for any pregnant woman or any other person who, with intent to procure such woman's miscarriage unlawfully, administers any poison or other noxious thing or who unlawfully uses any instrument or other means with intent to procure her miscarriage. Section 73 also prescribes a punishment of imprisonment for life, with or without hard labor on conviction. Section 73, Mr. Speaker, makes it a misdemeanor for anyone to unlawfully supply or procure the means to cause a miscarriage knowing that they were to be used for this purpose. In medicine, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to dissect the meaning of abortion and how the circumstances under which an abortion can take place. And I think the definition is important, given some numbers that were given in the discussion earlier. In medicine, the term abortion is defined as the premature exit of the products of conception, that is the fetus, fetal membranes, and placenta from the uterus. The terms relates to the loss of a pregnancy and not to why, and this is important, why that pregnancy was lost. Globally, Mr. Speaker, approximately a third of pregnancies end in an abortion, and many of these occur in the first 3 months of pregnancy. The majority of these abortions cannot be avoided and are considered spontaneous. In layman's terms, Mr. Speaker, spontaneous abortions are generally referred to as miscarriages. Induced abortions occur when methods are employed to terminate a pregnancy. In our case, Mr. Speaker, health statistics, stats that we collect in public health, includes both spontaneous and induced abortions. So sometimes when we quote the figures, one has to be mindful that in a very large percentage of the time, it's not induced, it's spontaneous. I'll give you some stats, Mr. Speaker, for the benefit of just understanding the extent of the issue. In 2016, there were 1,177 admissions to the Victoria Jubilee Hospital for complications threatening the viability of pregnancy, broadly termed abortions. These include incomplete, inevitable and threatened pregnancies, spontaneous abortions, as well as induced termination of pregnancy. 47 of that number, or 4%, of these patients were admitted with complications of either a failed attempt or completed induced termination of pregnancy as disclosed by the patient. And that last piece about disclosed by the patient is important because, frankly speaking, there are many times when the patient does not disclose. And therefore, even in the case of that 4%, it may be a conservative number. So it's theoretically possible that it could be more on the induced abortion side. Induced abortions may take place by the administration of drugs or by surgical means. At the point of presenting to hospital, it is difficult to say whether the abortion was spontaneous or induced. The Ministry of Health does not require currently that women state whether or not they have attempted to terminate a pregnancy, and documentation or reporting of induced abortion is therefore very unreliable, Mr. Speaker. Maybe this is something we need to address, but it's difficult again if the person involved does not state up front the particular case. Persons exposed to unsafe abortion practices and suffer complications, or persons who have induced abortions and start to show signs of abortion, such as bleeding or cramping, can attend the public hospital for treatment. Access, Mr. Speaker, to management of complications of unsafe abortions is not an option. I mean, from the public health perspective, guided by WHO guidelines, we give access to all who require that access, whether induced or otherwise. Jamaica is committed on a more general scale, Mr. Speaker, to reducing the maternal mortality ratio to less than 70 per 100,000 live births by the year 2030. In 2016, the maternal mortality ratio was 110 per 100,000 live births. Based on data available, the most common causes of maternal deaths are pregnancy-induced hypertension, obstetric hemorrhage, diseases of cardiovascular system, ectopic pregnancy, sickle cell disease, obstetric infections, and cancers. And so, Mr. Speaker, there are many other issues that have to be addressed from a public health standpoint in order to address the loss and to meet the target that has been set. For the maternal mortality rate to be fully understood, therefore, and this is important in the discussion around abortions, more information is required on the circumstances in which the termination of a pregnancy occurs, misuse of drugs available on the black market, for example, to induce abortions, and the procuring of surgical services that are unsafe may result in serious complications such as hemorrhaging and infections that can result in increased mortality. The thrust, therefore, Mr. Speaker, of the Ministry of Health is to empower the population to make informed decisions with respect to their health. Measures to reduce the incidence of unintended pregnancies and unsafe abortions must include investments in sexual and reproductive health services that are wide-reaching. And up to now, we have been involved in a number of things: counseling and information and education, safe motherhood, including antenatal care, safe delivery care, gynecological care, including prevention of abortion, treatment of complications, prevention and treatment of sexually transmitted infections, addressing diseases and malignancies of the reproductive system, and other such preventative measures as part of managing a process of giving information sufficient to make informed decisions and to have safe deliveries. The Ministry of Health is pursuing the development of a sexual reproductive health policy that will address these areas. A sexual and reproductive health policy will create a framework for identifying effective strategies to reduce maternal mortality rates, including strengthening the linkages between obstetric and NCD programs and reviewing our capacity within the health sector to respond effectively to cases of unsafe abortions. Now, Mr. Speaker, in relation to the law, the Offences Against the Persons Act long prohibited unlawful abortions, and the evolution in English law of guidelines on lawful versus unlawful termination of pregnancies has not been adopted in this jurisdiction. This is in an area in which publicly held values and morals have a strong impact on public policy, and that should be recognized. Through the Ministry of Health and the National Family Planning Board, in its response to Cabinet's request for broad consultation on key sexual reproductive health issues, conducted surveys and consultative discussions in 2016 with community representatives on the acceptable parameters of national policy on the termination of pregnancy. The over 350 community members surveyed, Mr. Speaker, largely agreed that termination where the pregnancy presents a risk to the life of the baby, 78% agreed, or mother, 86%, are necessary. Termination is necessary in these cases. And also where pregnancy occurs as a result of rape, some 71% of that group interviewed supported abortion on those limited grounds. While these public sentiments are an important guide, Mr. Speaker, to policymakers across all sectors, the Ministry of Health further recognized that it has a critical role to play in providing guidance on the health-specific implications of these issues. In 1975, in an attempt to clarify the position of the then Minister of Health, established a ministerial policy under which health personnel, that is, registered medical practitioners, could in fact terminate pregnancy on a very limited basis. So 2 doctors had to agree that there was a risk to the mother to facilitate termination. According to the ministry paper entitled Abortion Statement of Policy, which was laid before the House of Representatives in January of 1975, it was intended that the relevant sections of the Offences Against the Person Act be amended for clarity as to the circumstances in which abortion could be lawfully performed in Jamaica, and to include rape, carnal abuse, and incest as lawful grounds for abortion. As the law was never amended to achieve the objectives, an abortion policy review group was established by the Ministry of Health in 2005. So we're traveling a very long way on this issue, Mr. Speaker, without a definitive position, and I think the time is now right for that. The final report of the Ministry of Health, Jamaica, Abortion Policy Review Advisory Group, was laid on the table of the House on the 15th day of January 2008. Members of this Honourable House are reminded that on the 27th of March 2008, on a motion by the Leader of the House, a resolution was passed by the House of Representatives to appoint a special select committee to sit jointly with a similar committee appointed by the Senate to consider and report on the recommendations of the advisory group. And I think that's where we now pick up from what the member on the opposite side, Leader of Opposition Business, indicated. Number of meetings took place, 17. My colleague led that, and a report was in fact generated. The issue now is what happened after. And sad to say, Mr. Speaker, members, nothing. And so, given the interest, given the concern, and certainly from a public health perspective, the concern of the Ministry of Health, the concern of the population, the concern on both sides, I believe that the time is now right for us to find a way through a joint committee to review that report, pull that report back from the House in Hansard and wherever else it is, review the recommendations of that committee, and if there is a need to add further work, then we add further work in terms of consultation. From my perspective, Mr. Speaker, as Minister of Health and a member of the Cabinet, I will take the responsibility. It is my responsibility to take whatever is decided on in terms of the approach, in terms of the recommendations to Cabinet so that an appropriate decision can be made and it be brought here for approval. Mr. Speaker, I support the motion to the extent that the matter requires attention and firm decision. And that is the proposal at this point. Thank you very much.
Okay, Mr. Speaker, now we turn. Thank you very much for that, Minister of Health. That's the assurance I think the House wanted to hear. The next matter we will be taking, Mr. Speaker, is the Chairman of the PAAC, who is going to clean up the order paper today. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today we're going to, as the Leader of Government Business stated, just clean up the reports that are on the order paper. We have items 25, 49, 53, 65, and 66, and that will take them all. Those would be the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation, Ministry of National Security, Industry, Commerce, Fisheries, and Fisheries, and the annual report. Mr. Speaker, I'll just make two brief comments on the deliberations. The reports are there for all to see. I would make one on the Ministry of Industry, Commerce, Agriculture, and Fisheries, that one of the issues that was brought up at the committee level, and I think it is something that is of moment now, and was that the slow pace of progress of the Cannabis Licensing Authority. We found at the committee, and this report is, we had 3 meetings between November 9th and 29th of last year, 2017, and what we found is that the Cannabis Licensing Authority, after 2.5 years since its April 2015 establishment, it had approved only 2 applications from the 315 that it had received. and our committee had indicated that we wanted to see that process speeded up. For the minister, we have heard some pronouncements recently, and also that we wanted to say to the Parliament that smaller persons in the industry should be afforded every opportunity to participate in the supply chain for marijuana as cultivators, transporters, processors, and retailers. So, Mr. Speaker, with all that we are hearing now with regard to Canada and the opening up of marijuana there, I think it is a moment that the Parliament recommend this, and I would hope that the recommendations from these reports, when adopted, will go to Cabinet for consideration. The second thing, Mr. Speaker, reports number 49 and 53 have to do with the Ministry of National Security. Those were held late 2017, during that period, and again in the middle of this year. Had to do with the used motor vehicles that had been purchased by the Ministry of National Security. The report, Mr. Speaker, speaks to the fact that it was the intention of government to purchase 200 pre-owned motor vehicles. $213 million was paid over. A performance bond was acquired after that, and up to this point in time, 36 motor vehicles have been received. Mr. Speaker, the report is there. The committee was to have asked the Ministry of National Security to come back. They came in, would be May of this year, but it was still under investigation, and the committee members had a discussion, and we deferred it. We had actually deferred it to September. We have not called them back since that period of time. And the committee will have to at some point look at it. As Speaker, as the House will recall, this matter was first brought to the attention of the committee exactly 1 year ago in October of 2017, and we're now in 2018. The only information that I would bring to attention now is that we had written to the Ministry of National Security to ask them for us to meet with them during September, October, November period. We had gotten a reply from them on September the 6th, 2018. And I would just say to you, just as an update for the House, that they have here, in response dated August 29, 2018, see attached for ease of reference, we had submitted the requested report, which indicated that a total of 36 vehicles have been supplied from O'Brien's. In that letter, we had also indicated that mediation was scheduled for today. That was September the 6th, 2018. However, on Monday, September the 3rd, 2018, the attorney at law, Mr. Abraham Dabdoo, who represents the supplier, indicated that he would be unable to attend. The new suggested date for mediation is September the 24th, 2018. By way of update, the JCF's fraud squad in the Counterterrorism and Organized Crime Investigation Branch, CTOC, have informed us that they are proceeding steadily with their criminal investigation of this matter. Information in relation to the specific areas in the JCF where the 36 vehicles are now being utilized will be provided. So, Mr. Speaker, September, yes, the investigation is going on one side, and on the other side of it, they have gone to the Attorney General's department and gotten the guidelines for investigation, for mediation. There were members on the committee that had concerns about it. Just to say that, Mr. Speaker, through you, that Our concern is that 1 year later, the criminal investigations continue, the mediation continues, and we still only have 36 vehicles. So that's the report that I have on the table. I lay it for your consideration, for the consideration of the House, and I don't know if anybody has anything to say on this matter.
Mr. Speaker, just add support by the chairman of the committee and the latter point that he raised regarding the two processes that were in train, that of the criminal investigation and the mediation. Subsequent to the tabling of the report, there was reports in the media that mediation exercise was complete. And let me hasten to say, Mr. Speaker, one of the concerns of the committee was how long the process was taking, given one, the government had upfronted the money, the tune of 50% of the amount, over $230 million, for which only 36 were delivered. And that was against the background of the urgency, that the urgency of the delivery of the vehicles for the police. Mr. Speaker, you would have heard many times in the media that many communities throughout the country have to struggle with the severe shortage of motor vehicle to respond to calls by distressed Jamaicans from time to time, and not being able to respond when we had this significant layout of monies. And in respect of the mediation, Mr. Speaker, the truth be told, it has taken an inordinately long time for that process. But pleased that finally it is completed, and I am anxious to know what the results of that mediation exercise is. We deferred comments on it at the time, as was requested by the Ministry of National Security, so as not to seem to infringe on the deliberations that were taking place. But now that is true, the results of it is available, and it would be indeed be useful if the Minister, being with us this evening, could update the House on that outcome. After all, it is one of public interest, and indeed of the committee in particular. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Minister Joe. So assure my colleague and the members of the House that mediation did go through. We engaged not the AG's office, not because of any practical. We engaged Queen's Counsel Walter Scott, who conducted the mediation on behalf of the ministry, and they came to an agreement. And as soon as I've gotten a signed document, I will be bringing it to the House. It did take place on the second date indicated. I guess it's quite contentious. The agreement will ensure that the government recovers its full cost of $213 million. There will be no further extension of the contract, and the object was to conclude the agreement and protect the government's interests. And what I have at this point, that was so done, and I'll bring the details to the House, how that is being completed. The work of the investigating authority, I'm not aware where that is. It is a police matter, and if they find anything that was fraudulent or so, I'm sure they'll bring it to my attention and do required prosecution. But the mediation went through according to contract, and my understanding, we have a acceptable agreement to proceed on. I should mention, from the member from part of St. Catherine concerned, that during the course of this year budget, we have already acquired 65 new vehicles and an additional just under 100 bikes, which have been added to the police fleet, and there's another 50 new vehicles to be acquired. And in the new financial year, we are proceeding to take steps to refleet the police.
All right. Just two quick things I would say. We're pleased to hear that the mediation is completed. There was a lot of concern because in a letter that had been sent to the ministry in December of last year had given the Ministry of National Security a timeline within which to pay the bonds to the Ministry of Finance. If it had not been paid by the dealer, it would have to be paid by the ministry. So I'm hoping that everything now will be cleared up.
That's basically the performance bond, which was paid to the ministry.
No, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, the performance bond, but that's being said.
No, I was saying that the area of contention, and you would know better than me, was that the dealer did not want to pay certain duties. And so the duties had not been paid. So what happened was that a timeline had been given. So I think what would be important is that once this information is made public, we certainly at the committee, I'm sure, would be interested to look at it just to clarify it. But we will, there's a timeline, we'll be able to get that sooner rather than later. That would be good, and then we can probably take it and look at it. The other issue which I had not mentioned with that is that subsequent this information that we have gotten to the committee had to do with the suitability of these motor vehicles. Now, I think that the point was made that this will no longer go forward as a policy. It will not be. We will not be using used car vehicles, but I think it is something that we have to lay that as a. Was my understanding, but I think it's something that we have to be. All right. So with that, yeah. But as I said, the suitability of the vehicles has been questioned, and it's something to look at. Mr. Speaker, with that, I ask the House to approve the reports.
Not police vehicles, those are farm vehicles.
Yeah, but as I said, the other reports can be taken as laid.
Those in favor? Those against? Ayes have it. House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, in keeping with our intention to devise the appropriate strategy to deal with the resolution that deals with the Offences Against the Persons Act, you might want to invite the mover of the motion to, at this stage, indicate the way forward, as there are no, I get the sense that there are no other members prepared to make any further contribution in light of the disclosures about the previous exercise and so on and so forth. You might invite her to give an indication as to what is the recommended position going forward with the management of this resolution.
Mrs. Scott Redfield.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me say a huge thank you to the members that were a part of the advisory committee back in 2007, 2008, and they are still in this House. At least some of them are still in this House. Member Lisa Hanna, Member Nita Headley, Member Shahina Robinson, Marissa Del Rimpo, Member... Okay. All of the persons who were part of the advisory committee, I want to say thanks, because I know it was rather stressful. It was not something very easy for you to have done, to have undertaken. Let me also thank our minister, who has given an undertaking, and I'm comforted by that undertaking, Minister. And so I would like to say, be it further resolved that this motion be referred to the Human Resource and Social Development Committee of the House of Representatives for consideration, for further consideration and debate on this matter. And ask that I'm added to that committee for us to somehow come to not have this linger, and being debated, but to come to some sort of an agreement with our recommendations. I thank you.
So, Mr. Speaker, that brings us to the end of today's
House Leader.
Oh, sorry.
Those in favor of the motion, those against, ayes have it. House Leader.
Yes, as I was saying, I wish to comment on the strength of the program that we have embarked on by exposing everyone to discussion on motions that were lingering on the order paper. And but it's good that we're making progress. Mr. Speaker, I am going to indicate, as I see some of the members here, what we propose to take so that they are prepared. Item number 7, standing in the name of the member from Northwest St. Anne, Northwest St. Anne. Item number 15, standing in the name of the member from Western St. Andrew, who is here. And item number 41, standing in the name of the member from Southeast St. Catherine, who I saw earlier. We had discussed it. So those 3 members can be prepared to debate to bring their motion to the House at the next sitting of the House. So what is my intention to do is to advise the members before, so that I am not accused by my opposite number. I am recalling that historically, each year we debate or we present a debate, a motion on the question of the embargo by the United States of Cuba. And this year will be no exception. We had hoped to have it taken today, but time did not permit. So I wish to give notice that at the next sitting of the House, we will move that motion and have an open discussion on exactly what Jamaica's position is in respect of the embargo on Cuba. So I prepare the House for that as well. So, Mr. Speaker, there is no intention to do any further business, so I ask you to suspend the sitting of the House until Tuesday, the 30th of October at 2 p.m. Thank you.
Motion is that the House be now adjourned until Tuesday, the 30th of October 2018. Those in favor? Those against? Ayes have it. This House now stands adjourned.